April 10th, 1826, Palm Sunday. A 12-year-old girl named Eleni stands at the gates of Missolonghi holding her mother's hand. They're part of 10,000 people, the entire surviving population, preparing to walk out of the city they've defended for a year. Eleni hasn't eaten real food in 3 months. Her stomach is distended from starvation, her arms are stick-thin, her teeth are loose from scurvy. She weighs maybe 20 kilograms. She can barely walk. But she's holding a small dagger her father gave her before he died, defending the walls last month. Her mother whispers when the soldiers come, "Use it on yourself, not them." Eleni is 12 years old and she understands exactly what this means. In 6 hours, she will be trampled to death by cavalry horses in the mud between the city gates and the Ottoman siege lines. Her body will be one of thousands, creating a carpet of corpses so thick that horses couldn't walk without stepping on human remains. This wasn't a battle. This was a funeral procession where the mourners became the corpses and the entire world was watching. Here's what nobody tells you about the siege of Missolonghi. It wasn't won or lost through military genius or tactical brilliance. It was decided by mathematics of starvation, by the physics of how long human bodies can function without food, by the psychology of how much suffering people can endure before they choose mass suicide over surrender. Ibrahim Pasha brought 30,000 professional soldiers trained by French veterans of the Napoleonic Wars. Modern infantry with bayonets, artillery corps with siege engineers, cavalry divisions with Mamluk lancers. He faced 4,000 starving Greek irregulars defending a town with walls made literally of dried mud, armed with whatever weapons they could scavenge, supplied by fishing boats sneaking through lagoon channels. The military outcome was mathematically certain from day one, yet the siege lasted over a year, cost thousands of Egyptian and Ottoman lives, and ultimately failed in its strategic objective, because the defenders made a choice that transcended military logic. They chose to die free rather than live enslaved, and in doing so, they changed world history. What I'm about to show you isn't a romantic story about heroic resistance. This is a descent into the horror of siege warfare, where the weapon isn't the sword but starvation, where children are eaten by their own mothers, driven mad by hunger, where entire neighborhoods blow themselves up rather than face capture, where 10,000 civilians attempt to mass breakout through enemy lines knowing they're walking to certain death. This siege produced casualty rates and atrocities that shocked, even hardened 19th century observers. The statistics are brutal. Of 10,000 civilians who attempted the exodus, fewer than 100 survived. Of 3,000 soldiers, only 1,300 reached safety. The city that fell had been reduced from a population of 15,000 to approximately 3,000 living skeletons, with the rest dead from starvation, disease, or violence. Archaeological excavations still find mass graves, but here's the paradox that makes this story extraordinary. This total military defeat became the decisive turning point that won Greek independence. The martyrdom of Missolonghi forced European powers to intervene, leading directly to the naval battle that destroyed Ottoman power and secured Greek freedom. They lost everything: their lives, their families, their city. But in dying, they achieved what years of military victories couldn't. Stay with me, because understanding how this happened requires understanding the unique geography that made this mud-walled fishing village the most strategically important location in Greece. Picture a town that makes absolutely no sense as a military stronghold. Missolonghi sits at sea level on the edge of a shallow lagoon, surrounded by marshland that floods seasonally. The walls are earthen ramparts, literally piles of mud hardened in the sun, maybe 4 to 5 meters high at their strongest points. There's no stone fortification, no commanding high ground, no natural defensive features except one. The lagoon itself is a maze of shallow channels, sandbars, and shifting silt that makes navigation impossible for anyone who doesn't know the exact pathways. Deep draft warships run aground kilometers from the town. Only small, flat-bottomed boats can navigate the labyrinth, and even they need local guides who know where the channels are this week because they shift with every storm. This geographic peculiarity meant that any attack on Missolonghi had to be amphibious, slow, and exposed. Soldiers had to wade through knee-deep water and mud under fire from defenders who knew every channel and sandbar. The town's importance was strategic, not geographic. It controlled access to western Greece, the Peloponnese to the south, Epirus to the north, the Ionian Islands to the west, providing supply routes from sympathetic Europeans. Whoever held Missolonghi controlled the movement of supplies, reinforcements, and refugees throughout the rebellion. When the Greek Revolution began in 1821, Missolonghi declared for independence immediately and became a haven for refugees fleeing Ottoman reprisals. The population swelled from maybe 3,000 permanent residents to 15,000 displaced families. Among these refugees were the Suliotes, legendary mountain warriors from Epirus who had fought the Ottomans for generations and brought with them a fighting culture that terrified even experienced Turkish soldiers. These weren't professional troops. They were clan warriors who treated combat as personal honor contests, who preferred hand-to-hand fighting with yatagans and daggers over standing in formation with muskets. They sang battle songs about Alexander the Great and considered dying in combat the highest honor achievable. By 1825, the Greek Revolution was collapsing. 4 years of fighting had drained treasuries, created internal civil wars between Greek factions, and exhausted the population. European powers watched with interest but refused to intervene because they didn't want to upset the balance of power by weakening the Ottoman Empire. The Sultan, frustrated by years of inconclusive warfare, where Ottoman armies won battles but couldn't crush the rebellion, made a strategic decision that changed everything. He called on his most powerful vassal, Muhammad Ali of Egypt, to finish what Ottoman forces couldn't. This wasn't a request for help. It was essentially outsourcing the genocide to a subordinate who had the resources and ruthlessness to execute it. Muhammad Ali sent his adopted son Ibrahim Pasha with an army that was qualitatively different from anything Greeks had faced. These weren't medieval warriors. They were modern soldiers trained by French military advisors who had served under Napoleon. They wore uniforms, they marched in formation, they executed complex maneuvers, they had professional artillery corps with siege engineers who knew how to construct approach trenches and battery positions. Most terrifyingly, they had discipline, they didn't break formation under fire, didn't flee when charged, didn't waste ammunition shooting wildly. Ibrahim Pasha landed in the Peloponnese in February 1825 with approximately 15,000 soldiers, plus support personnel. His campaign was systematic extermination. He didn't just defeat Greek forces, he erased them. He burned olive groves that had stood for centuries, destroying the economic base. He enslaved entire villages, shipping populations to Egyptian slave markets. He turned the fertile plains of the Morea into desert through scorched earth tactics that shocked even Ottoman observers who were accustomed to brutal warfare. His strategy was explicit. If you cannot catch the fish, drain the water. By destroying the civilian population that supported Greek fighters, he eliminated the rebellion's foundation. By late 1825, he had pacified the southern Peloponnese and turned his attention north to the symbol of resistance, Missolonghi, which had defied Ottoman sieges for 4 years. Can you imagine being a civilian in that town, watching the smoke from burning villages getting closer every day, knowing that the army approaching had a policy of total extermination? But Missolonghi had one advantage Ibrahim hadn't encountered: defenders who understood they were already dead and fought with the freedom that comes from having nothing left to lose. The first Ottoman siege of Missolonghi began in October 1822 under Omar Pasha, failed miserably, and was lifted after months of futile assaults. The second siege began in April 1825 under Reshid Pasha, called Kiutahi, or the Deaf One. And this is when Ibrahim's Egyptian forces joined. The combined army swelled to over 30,000 troops. Inside the mud walls were approximately 4,000 combat-capable defenders and 11,000 civilians. The mathematics was simple: 7 attackers for every defender. Military theory said the city should fall in days. What military theory didn't account for was the lagoon geography and the psychological profile of defenders who viewed death as preferable to surrender. Let me explain the physics of why this siege became a nightmare for Ibrahim, despite his overwhelming advantages. The siege began with Ibrahim's signature approach: professional military engineering. French advisors laid out zigzag approach trenches that allowed soldiers to advance toward the walls while minimizing exposure to defensive fire. They constructed artillery batteries at precisely calculated distances for maximum effect. They brought up siege guns that fired shells weighing 20 to 30 kilograms, capable of demolishing stone fortifications. The bombardment that followed was apocalyptic in scale. Thousands of shells rained on the town over days. The problem was that Missolonghi's walls weren't stone. They were dried mud and earth. Cannonballs didn't shatter these walls. They just buried themselves in the dirt. The mud absorbed impact that would have destroyed masonry. After days of bombardment that consumed enormous amounts of expensive ammunition, the walls were barely damaged. Ibrahim's artillery advantage was neutralized by the town's primitive construction materials. When bombardment failed to breach the walls, Ibrahim ordered direct assault. This is where the lagoon geography became lethal. His soldiers had to approach across open mudflats in formation, wading through water that varied from ankle-deep to waist-deep, depending on tides and rainfall. The mud sucked at their boots, breaking formations. The uneven ground prevented coordinated charges. Meanwhile, defenders on the earthen ramparts, positioned above the attackers, fired down into the struggling columns with devastating effect. The Suliotes didn't fire in disciplined volleys like European infantry. They fired individually as hunters, each shot aimed at a specific target: officers, standard bearers, artillery crews. Greek marksmanship, honed by decades of mountain warfare, picked off Egyptian soldiers with efficiency that shocked Ibrahim's commanders. Then came the charges. When Greek defenders saw Egyptian columns struggling in the mud, they didn't stay behind walls. They jumped over and charged with yatagans and daggers drawn. The psychological impact of skeletal men in filthy pleated kilts screaming battle cries while sprinting through artillery fire to engage in hand-to-hand combat was devastating to morale. Egyptian soldiers were trained to fight other soldiers in organized formations. They weren't prepared for what one observer called demons who fought like they were already dead. The early assaults cost Ibrahim hundreds of elite soldiers for minimal gains. He adjusted tactics, attempting night attacks to avoid Greek marksmanship. These failed because defenders who knew every meter of the lagoon could hear attackers splashing in the dark and prepare ambushes. He tried mining the walls, digging tunnels to plant explosives beneath fortifications. The water table was too high, tunnels flooded before reaching the walls. He tried incendiary shells to burn the town. The mud and dampness prevented sustained fires. Every tactical innovation failed against the combination of geography and desperate defenders. By March 1826, Ibrahim had been battering the walls for almost a year, with nothing to show but mounting casualties and demoralized troops. His 14-day boast had become a humiliation. The fortress was a joke. Mud walls defended by starving irregulars, yet it held. But Ibrahim was learning. If he couldn't break the walls, he'd break the supply line that kept defenders alive. The lagoon breathed through a network of small fortified islets, Basiladi, Dolmus, Klisova, that controlled the channels connecting Missolonghi to the open sea. Small Greek boats navigated these channels at night, bringing ammunition and food from the Ionian Islands, where sympathetic Europeans provided supplies. As long as these channels remained open, the town could survive indefinitely. Ibrahim understood that defeating Missolonghi required conquering the lagoon itself, metre by metre. The campaign to seize the islets began February 25th, 1826. Vasiladi fell first. Overwhelming artillery bombardment, followed by amphibious assault, overwhelmed the small garrison. Dolmus fell next after brutal hand-to-hand fighting in knee-deep water, where defenders fought until ammunition was exhausted, then fought with rocks. But Klisova was different. This islet was defended by 130 Sulioti warriors under Kitsos Tsavelas, a clan chief who treated warfare as blood feud and surrender as unthinkable dishonor. March 25th, the 5th anniversary of the Greek Revolution, Ibrahim decided to crush this final obstacle with overwhelming force. It was overkill motivated by frustration and hubris. He assembled an assault force, estimated at 4,000 to 5,000 soldiers, the elite of his Egyptian army, plus Ottoman auxiliaries, against 130 defenders on a mud mound barely large enough for all of them to stand. The battle that followed became legendary. Ibrahim's strategy was sound. Land overwhelming numbers, swamp the defenders, seize the position by mid-afternoon. The execution became a catastrophe that demonstrated what happens when modern military formations encounter terrain they're not designed for. The assault boats had to approach through shallow water filled with hidden sandbars. Many ran aground hundreds of meters from the islet. Soldiers jumped into water they thought was knee-deep and sank to their waists in clinging mud. They couldn't run, the mud held them. They couldn't take cover. There was none. They couldn't charge. The distance was too far. They became targets. The 130 Suliots had been preparing for this moment. They had pre-positioned every weapon, calculated exact ranges, established firing positions. When the Egyptian columns appeared struggling in the water, the defenders waited. Discipline for men who preferred screaming charges required superhuman control. But they waited until the attackers were in optimal killing range. Close enough that musket fire was lethal, far enough that they couldn't rush the position. Then they fired. The slaughter was methodical. Each defender aimed, fired, reloaded, aimed again with the practiced rhythm of hunters. The Egyptians in the water couldn't flee. The mud trapped them. They couldn't advance. They were being cut down. They couldn't retreat. Officers behind were pushing forward. They just died. The water turned red from blood mixing with mud. Bodies created floating obstacles that the next wave had to navigate around. The psychological horror of watching your comrades die helplessly in front of you while you waded forward knowing you'd face the same fate broke morale before soldiers even reached effective combat range. Ibrahim, watching from his flagship, couldn't believe what he was seeing. His professional army, the force that had conquered the Peloponnese, was being massacred by a handful of irregulars on a mudbank. He ordered officers to lead charges personally. They died. He ordered artillery support. The shallow water prevented ships from getting close enough. In desperation and rage, Ibrahim himself boarded a boat to rally his troops. He got close enough to the fighting to take a bullet through the leg, shot by a Greek defender who probably didn't even know he'd wounded the commanding general. The wound wasn't serious, but the symbolism was devastating. The conqueror of Greece had been personally defeated by the mud and blood of Klisova. By sunset, the attack was called off. The casualty count was staggering. Estimates vary, but modern historians suggest 2,500 to 3,000 Egyptian and Ottoman soldiers killed or wounded. The defenders lost approximately 35 men. This is one of the most lopsided tactical victories in military history. Roughly 70 attackers killed for every defender lost. Can you imagine the celebrations in Missolonghi that night when news arrived? They thought they'd broken Ibrahim. They were catastrophically wrong. The victory at Klisova sealed their doom. Ibrahim's response to the humiliation at Klisova was to abandon assault tactics entirely and commit to total blockade. If he couldn't take the town by force, he'd starve it into submission. The naval blockade was comprehensive and ruthless. He brought in shallow draft gunboats, specifically designed to navigate the lagoon channels. He linked ships together with chains and floating barriers. He posted patrols day and night on every waterway. By early April 1826, the seal was complete. Not a single supply boat could penetrate the cordon. Inside the walls, the stockpiles that had sustained the town through the siege were exhausted. The real horror was beginning. The progression of starvation in a besieged city follows predictable stages that have been documented in every major siege in history. And Missolonghi followed the pattern with mathematical precision. Stage 1, normal food runs out. By mid-April, the grain stores, dried fish, and preserved meats that constituted normal diet were completely exhausted. People shifted to what we'd call survival foods. Anything edible, but normally not consumed. They slaughtered the horses and donkeys that had been essential for transportation and labor. The meat was divided carefully by family size, but even with rationing, it lasted only days, because there were 15,000 mouths to feed. They ate the mules. They caught and ate the rats that infested the walls. They hunted mice with the same intensity previously reserved for hunting Ottoman soldiers. Cats and dogs disappeared. Every pigeon was trapped and consumed. This stage lasted approximately 2 weeks before all animal protein was exhausted. The psychological shift during this stage is subtle but important. People still believed they could survive because they were eating actual food, just unconventional food. Stage 2. Inedible materials become food. With no animal protein remaining, people turn to materials that provide calories but aren't food in any conventional sense. Leather was boiled for hours until softened enough to chew. The collagen provided minimal nutrition but filled stomachs temporarily. Shoes, belts, saddles, anything made from animal hide was boiled into a grey, gelatinous slime that tasted foul but could be swallowed. They ate oil-soaked rags used to clean rifles. The oil provided fat calories, even if the cloth itself was indigestible. They scavenged the lagoon for seaweed and kelp, boiling the salty mass until it broke down into something that could be consumed. They ate grass. They ate bark stripped from the few trees inside the walls. They boiled bones that had already been boiled multiple times for soup, then ground the bones into powder and consumed that. The diary entries from this period are harrowing. We are reduced to eating things that would disgust pigs, wrote one defender. This stage lasted approximately 3 weeks. Stage 3. Biological collapse. By late May, the human body's reserves were exhausted. Starvation has clinical stages. First, the body burns stored glycogen from liver and muscles. This takes about 24 hours. Then it starts burning fat reserves. This can last weeks, depending on starting body condition. When fat is depleted, the body begins consuming muscle tissue, including heart muscle. This is when visible starvation symptoms appear. Extreme thinness, distended bellies from fluid accumulation, edema in legs and feet, skin lesions that won't heal. Scurvy appears when vitamin C reserves deplete. Gums bleed, teeth loosen and fall out. Old wounds reopen. People become too weak to walk. Then the mind goes. Starvation causes cognitive impairment, hallucinations, and psychological collapse. Mothers stop lactating. Infants starved, even when adults tried feeding them pre-chewed leather. Children died first because they had smaller reserves, then the elderly. Archaeological evidence from the mass graves shows skeletal remains with markers of extreme malnutrition, bone density loss, growth arrest lines in children's bones, evidence of scurvy and rickets. The psychological breakdown was as lethal as the physical starvation. Modern psychology recognizes starvation psychosis as a clinical syndrome. Extreme hunger triggers obsessive thinking about food, paranoia, aggression, and eventually complete apathy where the person simply lies down and waits to die. Survivors recorded instances of mothers driven mad by their children's cries for food. There are unconfirmed reports, never verified, but persistently repeated, of cannibalism in the final weeks. Whether true or not, the fact that such rumors circulated indicates the psychological horror people were experiencing. Can you imagine watching your child die of starvation over weeks, their body literally consuming itself, while Ottoman campfires across the siege lines roasted meat that filled the air with smells that drove starving people insane? But even in this hell, they refused to surrender. Which brings us to Ibrahim's incomprehension and the final desperate plan. Ibrahim didn't understand what he was facing. From his perspective, the military situation was objectively hopeless for the defenders. They were starving. They had no ammunition reserves. They couldn't sally out. Too weak to fight. They couldn't hold the walls. Too few defenders for the perimeter. A simple assault would overwhelm them. Yet when he sent envoys offering generous surrender terms, life, freedom to leave, food, the response from the walls was silence or a single gunshot. He was a professional soldier trained in European military academies. He understood siege warfare, logistics, morale calculations. What he couldn't comprehend was that the defenders had entered a psychological state where death was preferable to surrender on principle, not strategy. They called it freedom or death, Eleutheria by Thanatos, and they meant it literally. The final council of war was held in late March 1826. The city's leadership, Bishop Joseph, the military commanders, clan chiefs, gathered in what remained of the town's administrative building. They looked at their forces. The 4,000 combat-capable defenders of a year ago were now perhaps 1,500 skeletal figures who could barely lift muskets. They assessed the civilian population. Maybe 10,000 remained alive, most too weak to walk. They counted ammunition, maybe a week's worth, if rationed strictly. They counted food, none. Medical supplies, none. They calculated survival time, 1 week, maybe 2, before people were too weak to resist even a token assault. Then they reviewed their options. Option 1, surrender. Ibrahim had promised mercy, safe passage, even potential prisoner exchanges. But they knew his track record, the burned villages, the slave markets full of Greeks. His word meant nothing. More fundamentally, 4 years of fighting couldn't end in submission. Their honor code made surrender unthinkable, regardless of consequences. Option 2, hold the walls and die in place. This was the conventional siege endgame. Wait for the final assault, fight to the last bullet, die defending your homes. The problem was they were too weak. When the Ottomans came, defenders would be slaughtered in their beds, unable to even stand. The women and children would be enslaved without resistance. The city would fall with a whimper rather than a statement. This was unacceptable to warriors who valued dramatic gesture. Option 3 was born from desperation and mythological thinking. What if they didn't wait for the enemy to come? What if they attacked, not a sortie, a mass breakout? Every man, woman, and child capable of walking would arm themselves, open the gates, and charge through the siege lines toward the mountains 40 kilometers away. Militarily, this was insanity. Civilians can't charge through professional siege lines. But militarily, they were already dead. This was about making a statement loud enough that Europe would hear. The plan crystallized through whispered discussions. The fighters would form the vanguard, 3 columns of the strongest warriors remaining, maybe 1,200 men total. They'd punch through the Ottoman siege lines, creating a corridor. Behind them would march the civilians, 10,000 people forming a massive column protected by armed escorts. They'd move at night to minimize casualties from artillery. They'd move fast, before the enemy could organize a response. If they succeeded, they'd reach friendly territory in the mountains. If they failed, they'd die free on the open plain rather than starving in the mud. The date was set, April 10th, Palm Sunday. The symbolism was deliberate. Christ's entry into Jerusalem, triumph before sacrifice. But what about those who couldn't walk? This is where the plan became apocalyptic. There were hundreds of wounded and sick who physically couldn't march. The leadership made a decision that sounds monstrous until you understand the context. These people would be left behind in prepared positions with gunpowder and torches. Their orders were to wait for the Ottoman advance, then detonate the magazines, taking as many enemies as possible with them. It was mass suicide as military tactic. Christos Kapsalis, an elderly, respected leader, volunteered to command the main magazine. He gathered those too wounded or sick to escape, and the families who chose to stay with them. They moved into the stone storage houses where gunpowder was kept. They sang funeral dirges while sitting on barrels of explosives. Young mothers made the choice between attempting escape with small children who'd slow them down and staying to die quickly rather than watch their children trampled. Some chose to stay. The psychological horror of these decisions, choosing which child to save, choosing whether to die now or later, broke people in ways combat never could. But the preparations continued because the alternative was waiting passively for slaughter. Can you imagine telling your sick father you're leaving him behind with explosives, knowing his last act on earth will be blowing himself up? That was April 9th, 1826, in Missolonghi, a city preparing for its own funeral. 8 p.m., April 10th. The gates of Missolonghi opened for the first time in months. The bridges, makeshift constructions of scavenged wood, were lowered across the moat. The exodus began in silence. The plan required stealth until they reached the Ottoman trenches, then speed and violence to break through. The first columns moved out into the darkness, 1,200 fighters forming 3 assault groups. Behind them came the civilians, a mass of 10,000 people moving slowly because most were too weak to walk normally. They moved like a funeral procession, which is exactly what it was. The plan relied on surprise. They needed to cross the open ground, hit the siege lines before the Ottomans could organize, break through the first defensive layer, and create chaos that would allow the civilian column to follow through the gap. If they achieved tactical surprise, it might work. They didn't achieve surprise. History records that a Bulgarian mercenary who'd been fighting for the Greeks deserted hours before the exodus and went straight to Ibrahim's tent. He told the Egyptians everything, the timing, the route, the composition of the columns. Ibrahim didn't order an immediate attack on the city. He did something more calculated. He repositioned his forces to create a killing ground. He reinforced exactly the sectors where the Greeks planned to strike. He positioned artillery pre-aimed at the bridges and the open ground they'd have to cross. He placed cavalry units on the flanks in concealed positions. He essentially turned the Greeks' assault route into an ambush zone. The trap was set. The attackers were walking into a prepared kill box without knowing it. The first Greek columns crossed the moat and the open ground successfully. They reached the first line of Ottoman trenches in darkness and silence. Greek fighters crept forward, expecting to find sleeping sentries they could silently eliminate. Then a single musket shot rang out the signal. Instantly, the night exploded into light. Flares and torches were ignited along the entire Ottoman siege line. The darkness that had protected the Greeks evaporated. What they saw froze them. Not scattered sentries, but prepared defensive positions bristling with loaded muskets and primed artillery. Then the cannons fired. Ibrahim's artillery crews had pre-sighted their guns on the exact routes the Greeks would take. Canister shot, tin cans filled with musket balls that turned cannons into giant shotguns, tore through the packed Greek columns. The sound was apocalyptic. The roar of dozens of cannons firing simultaneously, the screams of hundreds of men being shredded by flying metal, the confusion of darkness turned to flickering torchlight, revealing carnage. But the Greek vanguard didn't retreat. They roared, "Eleutheria! Freedom!" and charged directly into the guns. These were men who'd been starving for months, too weak to run normally, yet they found the strength to sprint toward enemy positions. They hit the Ottoman trenches with shocking violence, leaping into the defensive works, engaging in hand-to-hand combat with yatagans against bayonets, fighting with the desperate fury of people who knew they were already dead. For a moment, the sheer ferocity pushed the Ottomans back. The Greek assault penetrated the first defensive line, then the second. It looked like the impossible might happen. They might actually break through. Then disaster struck the civilian column. In the chaos and terror, artillery shells exploding, muzzle flashes illuminating scenes of slaughter, the screams of dying men. Someone shouted, "Opiso! Opiso! Back! Back!" Historians debate who gave this order. Some believe it was a traitor deliberately causing panic. Others think it was a confused officer seeing the cavalry trap on the flanks and trying to warn people. Others believe it was mass hallucination from exhausted, terrified civilians. The cause doesn't matter. The effect was catastrophic. The 10,000 civilians heard the retreat order and panicked. The column broke. Thousands of women and children turned and ran back toward the city gates. The exodus shattered. The fighting vanguard was cut off from the civilian mass they were supposed to protect. Ibrahim unleashed his cavalry. The Mamluk and Albanian horsemen had been waiting in concealed positions on the flanks. They didn't attack the fighters, they attacked the fleeing civilians. The killing ground between the city and the siege lines became a slaughterhouse. Cavalry sabers cut down women and children. Horses trampled people into the mud. The screaming was audible kilometers away. Those who reached the city gates found no safety. Ottoman infantry, sensing the rout, stormed the walls. The mud ramparts that had held for a year were overwhelmed by the flood of attackers. The fighting moved into the streets, into houses, into churches. Every building became a miniature fortress where dying defenders killed as many attackers as possible before being overwhelmed. This is where Missolonghi's legend was truly forged. Not in tactical victory, but in apocalyptic resistance. Wounded men fired from windows until bullets found them. Women threw stones from rooftops. Children stabbed at soldiers with kitchen knives. The Ottomans pushed the defenders back street by street toward the center, toward the stone houses where Christos Kapsalis waited. Can you imagine being that 12-year-old girl, trampled by cavalry, dying in mud alongside thousands of other civilians, watching your mother's last moments before a saber finds you both? That was the Exodus. Not a military operation, but a mass martyrdom witnessed by the world. Christos Kapsalis sat in darkness inside the powder magazine. He was approximately 60 years old, elderly by contemporary standards, a respected community leader who'd chosen to die rather than escape. Around him sat the wounded who couldn't walk, elderly who'd refused to flee, mothers who'd stayed with sick children rather than abandon them. They'd been listening to the battle approaching for hours, the sound of gunfire getting closer, the screams, the smell of smoke. They knew what was coming. When the door burst open and Ottoman soldiers poured in expecting plunder and slaves, Kapsalis didn't hesitate or give speeches. He lowered the torch to the powder trail, leading to barrels containing hundreds of kilograms of gunpowder. The explosion wasn't just loud, it was tectonic. The entire neighborhood disintegrated. The blast wave threw bodies hundreds of meters. Kapsalis killed himself, everyone in the building, and approximately 200 to 300 Ottoman soldiers in the instant of the detonation. It wasn't the only explosion. Across the city, as Ottoman forces breached other strongpoints, the same scene repeated. Bishop Joseph barricaded in the windmill, with his congregation held out until ammunition was exhausted, then detonated the powder magazines there. Boom! Another neighborhood erased. Individual houses where defenders had retreated became individual bombs. When the door was forced, the torch was dropped. Boom, boom, boom. The city committed collective suicide. The night was illuminated by massive explosions that could be seen from ships at sea. The psychological impact on Ottoman soldiers was profound. They'd come to conquer a city, not fight ghosts who turned buildings into bombs. Many refused to enter houses even after the fighting stopped, terrified that the next door they opened would be their last. The victory tasted like ashes. They'd taken rubble and corpses, not a functioning city. The morning after revealed the true cost of the 1,200 fighters who attempted the breakout. Approximately 1,300 reached the mountain positions, a success rate of roughly 43%. Of the 10,000 civilians, the survival rate was perhaps 1%. Most died in the plain, trampled by cavalry or shot during the rout. Some made it back to the city and died in the explosions or the street fighting. The survivors, mostly young women and children, were captured and prepared for slave markets. They were chained and marched to the ships that would take them to Alexandria and Constantinople. The physical destruction was total. The city was smoking ruins. But the strategic victory was hollow. Ibrahim had promised the Sultan a swift victory that would crush the rebellion. Instead, he'd bought a devastated town at the cost of thousands of his professional soldiers and months of campaigning that had destroyed his army's morale. The casualty statistics tell the story. Ottoman and Egyptian forces lost approximately 8,000 to 10,000 soldiers killed and wounded during the entire siege. Approximately 1/4 to 1/3 of the besieging force. The defenders and civilians, approximately 12,000 dead from starvation, disease, combat, and the exodus. The ratio would suggest Ottoman victory, except for one detail. Ibrahim had a replaceable professional army, while the Greeks had just created irreplaceable martyrs. News of the fall spread through Europe like wildfire. The stories of the starvation, the exodus, the suicide explosions reached newspapers in London, Paris, Berlin, St. Petersburg within weeks. The public reaction was seismic. Philhellenism, love of Greek culture, transformed from intellectual hobby to mass political movement. Eugene Delacroix painted Greece on the ruins of Missolonghi, depicting a woman representing Greece standing with open arms over rubble. It became the Guernica of the 19th century. Victor Hugo wrote poems. Byron had died in this city 2 years earlier, cementing it as the romantic heart of the revolution. The combination of starvation, martyrdom, and mass suicide created a narrative so powerful that European governments couldn't ignore public pressure. The Treaty of London was signed July 1827, barely 15 months after Missolonghi fell. Britain, France, and Russia agreed to intervene in the Greek War. This led directly to the Battle of Navarino, October 1827, where combined European fleets destroyed the Ottoman Egyptian navy in 4 hours of battle. Ibrahim's ships, the same ones that had blockaded Missolonghi, were annihilated. This was the decisive moment of the war, and it happened because Missolonghi's martyrdom forced Europe to act. If the city had surrendered in January, there would have been no outcry, no intervention. The Greek Revolution would have ended as a failed rebellion, crushed by professional armies. But because they held, because they starved, because they blew themselves up rather than submit, they created martyrs that forced the world to grant what military victory couldn't achieve: independence. Ibrahim Pasha is remembered as a brutal conqueror whose victory was hollow. The defenders are eternal, the ultimate proof that you can defeat an army, but you cannot defeat a people who prefer death to slavery. We can see that the siege of Missolonghi was decided not by military capability but by will, the calculation of how much suffering people would endure before surrender. Ibrahim brought overwhelming force, professional tactics, modern equipment, and ultimately achieved military victory by capturing the ruins. But he failed strategically, because the defenders made a choice that transcended military logic. They weaponized their own martyrdom, turning their deaths into political leverage that forced European intervention. The mathematics of siege warfare say the defenders should have surrendered months earlier when starvation became terminal. The mythology says they chose freedom over survival, and in dying created the conditions for their nation's birth. Both are true. The 10,000 ghosts of Missolonghi stand as permanent reminder that the most powerful weapon in war isn't superior firepower or tactical genius. It's the human will to endure the unendurable and force the world to acknowledge that some things matter more than survival.
Want to explore more battles where desperate defenders turn certain defeat into strategic victory through sheer determination? Subscribe to Medieval Spirits right now.
We're investigating historical sieges that prove human will can overcome overwhelming odds when survival becomes less important than the cause you're fighting for. Join us as we examine the Siege of Malta, where Christian knights held against Ottoman Empire's greatest invasion, the Siege of Badajoz, where British forces captured supposedly impregnable fortress through suicidal storming, the defense of Saragossa, where Spanish civilians fought Napoleon's army house by house until the city was literally rubble. These aren't just military history. They're testaments to what humans will endure when freedom matters more than life itself. The defenders of Missolonghi proved that martyrdom can be more powerful than victory, that dying for a cause can achieve what living soldiers cannot, what other desperate last stands changed history through sacrifice. Find out on Medieval Spirits. Hit subscribe, because the past teaches that courage isn't just fighting when you can win, it's fighting when defeat is certain, because some principles are worth dying for. And we're preserving these lessons one video at a time.